Welcome back to our studies in medieval philosophy. This lesson we're going to be carrying on talking about the writings of Boethius, and fundamentally what we did in the previous video was spend just a little bit of time talking about the ways in which Boethius contributed to philosophy, but not necessarily through the perspective of actually coming up with his own philosophical ideas and his own philosophical thought processes. But when it comes to just the basic translation of old philosophical texts, we remember from the previous lesson that Boethius had a quite unique and special aptitude towards language and was able to master Greek and Latin, which is obviously very useful for this period, given the fact that we want to see the translation of some of the texts that have been discovered in terms of Plato and Aristotle, and translate them from their ancient Greek into Latin, and so that they are readable across the Roman Empire. This lesson, however, is going to focus on a very specific element of his philosophy, arguably the most important original contribution to philosophy that Boethius essentially advocates for throughout his life, and this was something that was written during his time in prison and during his time waiting his execution, and this is his Consolations of Philosophy. So, as noted, the previous lesson spent some time looking at the life of Boethius, generally one of the most important philosophical thinkers of the late classical period. This lesson is going to talk about what is probably his most important novel or original contribution to philosophy, this of course being his Consolations, sometimes titled On the Consolidation of Philosophy, which is sort of the formal title. So, as a basic and a brief overview of the context and the general background of this writing, Boethius's Consolidation was written while, like I said, he was being imprisoned, awaiting his execution. We remember from the previous lesson that we spent some time talking about his fall from power and his political ventures and the ways in which he was essentially driven out, and he was accused of planning and harboring rebellious activities. So this is what takes place. His writings, at least of his Consolidation, was taking place in around 523. Now, it proves to be one of the most important pieces of philosophical writings. In fact, it was translated by many people across the world into all kinds of languages, including in the United Kingdom, or the soon-to-be United Kingdom, should I say. I wouldn't call it the United Kingdom today, at the time at which it was written, by Alfred the Great, so the person who sort of laid the foundations for the consolidation of the Heptarchy into what becomes England under his grandson Ethelstan, as well as, of course, Elizabeth I, who reigned in England from 1558 to 1601. Arguably one of the most important contributors to the development of the unification eventually of England and Great Britain. Of course, when we go away from the Tudor period into the Stuarts, but fundamentally Elizabeth I was one of the most influential of the Tudor monarchs. You would arguably put her either first or at least definitely second place in terms of influential monarchs behind under the Tudors, behind Henry VIII, which was of course her dad. The work itself is structured into a conversation between himself, Boethius himself, and what is described as Lady Philosophy, the sort of personification of the discipline more generally. And so the work itself is relatively fluid in terms of what is discussed, the kind of things that are examined throughout, but they talk about Boethius and Lady Philosophy, discussing back and forth a number of important things and a number of important issues that are really paramount in terms of our understanding of philosophy. So things like justice, determinism, wealth and value. They spend time talking about the problem of evil and the nature of humanity, human nature. The work itself is divided into 5 major texts, the first being Book 1, of course, the first of the books, which is a discussion about the imprisonment of Boethius, who is then visited by the personification of philosophy. So Boethius is sort of waxing lyrical, if you will, about his imprisonment and the plight of his condition. At which point he's visited by this personification of philosophy. At which point books 2 all the way to 5 then goes on to discussing with Lady Philosophy some of the most important philosophical issues, a host of philosophically interesting discussions. Now, without diving into just the descriptive realities of this particular text, and just going through what each of these books says and what each of the things that Boethius says about these things are, fundamentally I think it's important to think about the context and some of the more scholarly debate around some of the things that had been said fundamentally. And one of the things that's interesting here is that there is a distinct lack of Christianity as either a guide or a tool or even that much of a reference throughout this text. At the time Boethius was writing, obviously Christianity was the predominant philosophical and theological lens through which analysis would take place. You have, of course, the Roman Empire adopting Christianity and then spreading it across the entire part of the entirety of the European continent. You do eventually, in time, start to see a golden age in the Islamic world and the sort of the influence of Islam throughout the Middle East and stuff like that, but fundamentally, at this point, we're talking about Christianity, and we'll talk about Islam in the next few lessons. So it's interesting that given how predominant and given how important Christianity is as a philosophical and a theological lens through which everything is essentially discussed during this period, it is quite interesting that Boethius is able to discuss a whole host of these philosophical issues without making a specific reference to Christianity. Even, and you might be surprised to hear that some of the discussions that Boethius actually has with Lady Philosophy during his the Consolidation concerns religion. So there's actually a concern of religion itself throughout this particular series. And so even while talking about religion, Boethius is able to navigate that conversation without specific reference to the predominant religion through which he is examining. The lack of Christianity is also striking, given that this is the writings of a man who's about to be executed. And so you would conceivably come to the conclusion that, especially given the time period at which this was written, there might have been some sort of recollections and some kind of reminiscence and self-reflections about Boethius's specific relationship with his religion, with God, with Christianity, given that he is essentially about to meet his maker in not so many words. And so fundamentally, this is a very interesting question. It's led some people to believe and to come to the conclusion that what we see here with a lack of conversation about Christianity is actually evidence of the fact that Boethius moves away from Christianity and actually starts to adopt more pagan traditions as a result of a variety of different factors and the different combinations. As a sort of final note, it should be noted here that it's quite interesting how much the Consolations relies on the philosophical foundations which are actually derived from the classical period. We know from the previous lessons that Boethius spends a lot of his time discussing and translating the classical works, the Platos and the Aristotles. One of the things that's interesting here, though, is that there are different modes of interpreting the true meaning behind the Consolidation. And these are a couple of questions that you could really think about asking in relation to the Consolidation. Does philosophy, Lady Philosophy here, present herself as a kind of true authoritative figure? Or is the tense the text meant to present philosophy in a more negative light? Is there supposed to be a sort of a critique of philosophy, a critique of these sort of abstract ideas that don't really have any meaning in pragmatic political decision making? Does the text highlight the fact that questions of religion are also just simply questions of philosophy, to the extent to which that when he talks about philosophy, he is talking about various different elements of religion? Could it be argued that there is evidence of paganism at all, given the fact that a lot of people, or there are some scholars at least, that have come to the conclusion that this distinct lack of Christianity is evidence of him moving away from Christianity and moving towards more pagan beliefs? It seems quite interesting that there are actually also very little written about pagan religions or other religions as well. So this is also sort of tying into this generalized idea of the Consolations as a discussion about his relationship with religion. All of these are questions that could be answered and are interesting discussions to be having. So I hope you've liked this video. Make sure you go and subscribe if you want some more medieval philosophy. The next topic that we're going to be moving on to is doing a basic overview of some of the most important contributions to medieval philosophy by the Islamic world. We'll spend about 4 or 5 lessons talking about Islam. We'll talk about some of the most important Islamic thinkers and talk about some of the most important Islamic contributions to philosophy before we move back to the Christian world and start talking about Anselm of Canterbury.